Hey, everybody, and welcome to another My JavaScript Story. This week, we're talking to Dan Shappir. Dan, do you want to say hi?
Yes, hi, and you actually pronounced my last name very well, so thank you very much for that.
Hey, no problem. Now, we had you on JavaScript Jabber a while ago. I think we were talking about Wix and performance, if I remember right.
Yeah, so we were talking about, well, not so much Wix specifically. We were primarily talking about the web performance APIs,
Okay.
and from that, it kind of snowballed into talking about web performance in general.
Right. This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open source Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code devchat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code devchat at Sentry.io.
It was actually a really good talk. I really enjoyed it.
It was a lot of fun. It was episode 334. It was released October 2018. And we had a good talk. We had Amy Knight and Chris Ferdinandi on there as well. And that was a ton of fun. Now, if I remember right, like I said, you work for Wix and you live out in Israel.
Correct. I live in Tel Aviv in Israel, and I did and do still work at Wix.
Nice. Anything else that people should know about you? Things you like outside of code even?
Well, I'm married with 3 kids who are getting alarmingly big.
How big?
Yeah. Our baby is 17 years old, so that's really scary. Yeah. She's also getting into coding now, so I have a competition at home in that regard. And we have a dog. We live in Tel Aviv in Israel. We like to do a lot of traveling, so I tend to go to various places all over the world when we can. I don't know if it's exactly outside of work, but I do also really enjoy attending conferences and speaking in conferences when I can. So overall, I really enjoy what I'm doing, and life's good.
Nice. I'm also curious, what's your favorite part of what you do?
Oh, wow. That's an interesting question. We'll talk about it in a bit, I guess, but I've really been into software from a fairly young age. I've been trying to think ahead of this show what it is about software that I enjoy so much for such a long period of time. And I think it's 2 main things, I think, maybe more. It's that it's like riddle solving all the time. You're faced with new challenges all the time that you need to think through and find solutions for. So that's one thing I really enjoy. Another thing is that you have to kind of like keep on your toes and keep on learning new stuff. People were talking about JavaScript fatigue like a year or 2 ago, and I was thinking like, hey guys, you got it all backwards. It's awesome that we have to keep on learning new stuff all the time.
Yeah.
And one more thing is that I've never been much of a handyman. And with software, I get to create things, right out from my mind, from my brain, as it were. So things kind of flow through my fingertips from my imagination and get this sort of a virtualized reality, but actually impact the real world. I find that to be extremely cool.
Nice. Yeah, that hits a lot of things for me too. I really enjoy a lot of those aspects. And yeah, I mean, there's always new stuff to learn, and it's exciting. Super exciting. Now, you
Exactly.
alluded to this before, but let's go back and talk about how you got into software in the first place.
Oh, wow. So if your viewers could see me, they'd see that by the color of my hair that I'm definitely not new to this business. I actually got into software way, way back in the 80s of the previous millennium. Yeah, I was one of those kids that got a personal computer and started hacking away on it. Although I'm not sure that the term hacking would have applied back then because it wasn't really connected to anything. But almost from the get-go, when I got that computer, and I really just kind of fell in love with this whole concept of writing software.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, I was never really so much into games, video games, but almost from the get-go, I enjoyed creating games. So whenever I saw a game, I would try to think of whether I could try to mimic that game on my computer. So it was, I would use an Apple II, that kind of dates me, Commodore 64. My own computer was this really weird machine called the TI 994A. Don't know if you've ever heard of it.
My grandpa had one when I was a kid.
Okay.
And he was, it was kind of, it was this all-in-one machine, and the keyboard slid out of it. That's it, isn't it?
The keyboard was part of the computer. Computers did not really have separate keyboards at that time. It's funny. I was talking to people, when I talk to people, who are developers now, and I have them guess about how much RAM memory my first computer actually had. Some of them simply won't agree to go as low as it actually had. It seems like it doesn't seem actually possible for them. So these days where like your average website is something like 3 megabyte download or something like that. Right. My original home computer had 4K of RAM. Right. And I could actually, as a kid, write usable programs for that. So that was you learn to make do, I guess.
Yeah.
My first programming language was obviously BASIC. And I have to say that it then took me years to unlearn some of the bad habits that I got as a result of using that, because it was go-tos all over the place and not really modular programming at all. Yeah, and from there I progressed to a PC, and I started doing also, in addition to BASIC, I also started doing x86 assembly language. And then Turbo Pascal came along, which literally rocked my world. And all of a sudden, I could actually do real programming in something that really looked like an actual programming language with structures and whatnot. By the way, I can't emphasize enough how way ahead of its time Turbo Pascal was when it came out. And by the way, this is the same guy that later created C# and now TypeScript. It's the same guy.
Oh, I didn't realize that. It's Anders Heilsberg, if I remember.
Yes, exactly. He was the original creator of Turbo Pascal, as I recall.
Yeah, I've talked to Anders. We interviewed him for JavaScript Jabber a number of years ago at Microsoft Build, and yeah, it was really interesting to hear him talking about what went into it.
Yeah, he's definitely one of my heroes in this field. I guess I owe him quite a bit. And so I kind of played around with computers all through high school. Back then, you couldn't actually study computers at high school. So I was just, learning stuff on my own, getting magazines, reading books. Back then, you would still actually subscribe to magazines that would literally arrive at your house. And then, as an Israeli, most Israelis, when they're 18, we actually join the army. But I actually took this sort of you could call it an opposite route to what most kids do. You actually have this option of going to the university ahead of your military service. Military service in Israel, as I said, is mandatory. Men serve for 3 years. So you have this option of going to the university before the army, and then you kind of receive this sort of a promise that when you finish your studies, you would actually, when you serve in the army, you will actually do what you studied. So if you studied computers, you'll be working on computers in the army, in some sort of department or whatever that does software development or whatever, or something along these lines. So I actually went to the Hebrew University and studied computer software, bachelor's degree in computer software for 3 years.
Nice.
Which I enjoyed a lot. And after that, I actually indeed went into the army, where I ended up serving for quite a long time, relatively speaking. I actually served for some like 5.5 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So I was an officer in the Israeli Air Force. Most of my military career, you could say, was in the Air Force test range, where I was busy in missile experiments, lobbing things into the air. Most of what I did there, by the way, had to do with, I don't exactly know what the term for that would be. It was basically in experiment safety, to ensure that whatever it is that we were launching doesn't fall on anybody's head.
Right.
Israel is a fairly small country, and as opposed to let's say the U.S., where you have your test ranges placed at a reasonable far distance from major population centers, places like White Sands or whatever. Mm-hmm. In Israel, it's all kind of packed together. So the test range was actually alarmingly close to some of the major cities here in Israel. So we actually had a bit of a challenge making sure that if anything goes awry, the missile doesn't actually head over and then hit somebody's house or something.
Right.
So what I did mostly in that role was do all sorts of missile trajectory simulation. So I would actually write programs that, based on parameters that we got, would try to simulate worst case scenarios of what might happen with the missile's flight, and based on that, figure out whether or not we could actually safely do that experiment and under what parameters and restrictions and whatnot. So it wasn't like, building a large scale app, let's say, that you might do in a team. It was more of like doing a lot of ad hoc projects of doing these kinds of simulations. It was really interesting. And it was, I guess, kind of very different than what I would later do in most of my software career.
That's really interesting. And it's interesting too, because that kind of technology has come a long way. I mean, people talk about, even, especially with Israel, you have the Iron Dome and just, all of the, now it's not just, is it going to go to the right place, or is it going to hit the right stationary target? It can intercept another missile in the air. Yeah,
so I was actually involved in these types of experiments. So it was really interesting, like launching 2 missiles into the air and seeing if one could actually hit the other.
Yeah.
It was a very interesting and enjoyable time for me in that regard.
That's amazing. That's totally amazing to me.
Like I said, I served as an officer in the Israeli Air Force for 5.5 years. I actually also they actually gave me an option in the Army to actually start studying for a master's degree in computer science. So I did that as well. And after 5.5 years, I finished my military service, and I joined the industry right ahead of the .com bubble, which was also a very interesting period.
Yeah, I'll bet. Now, that was also around the period where, we were starting to see, JavaScript being used more, mainly because it was the only way you could do scripting, I guess, other than Java applets?
Yeah, so
Browser.
yeah, so actually, I didn't get to the browser immediately because,
Okay.
like, I think JavaScript came around 95, and I wasn't quite aware of that part yet. Actually, the first company I went to was a company that was working on multi-user games.
Oh, okay.
So up until that point, gaming was already fairly big, but people didn't really have connectivity at home at that time or until
Mhm.
that time. So most people would either just play solo, or if you played with your friends, it meant that, you would invite your friends over and you would connect several
Right.
controllers to the same console. And I joined this company who was trying to introduce the concept of multi-user games, over the network between different people in their own homes, so that you could kind of go on this kind of, I would say, forum, pick an
Mhm.
opponent, and then play games with them. And my job was to actually create some of the first games for that system, somewhere between a proof of concept and actually getting some of the initial subscribers, so that we could convince some of the larger game makers to actually join in. So it was actually a lot of fun to build these kind of games. Like, one game that I built was sort of like, you flew a helicopter and you would actually fight again, in sort of a 3D environment with other people who are also flying around and trying to shoot each other down. And there was also the
Mhm.
the 3D shooter game when you ran around a maze and
Yep.
also fired at others. So everything that you might expect from this type of an environment. It was fun, but it didn't actually seem to me that this was going somewhere. And then around 96, the whole industry was getting into a frenzy. And then I moved to a company who was actually more into actual, I wouldn't say web development at the beginning. It was more of an internet company.
Mhm.
Um, it was a company. Well, that's another interesting story. So I joined this company as employee number 8 or 9, something like that. I stayed there for something like 4.5 years. By the time I left, the company was worth something like $2 billion. So it was a pretty wild ride. Um, so that company actually developed a technology that would um, be able to download large media, let's say, resources down to people's home over the really limited connections that people used to have back then. So, now we take things like, what we're doing right now,
Mhm.
a video conversation, or maybe, streaming in 4K from home for granted. But back then, that would have seemed incredible. And you literally couldn't even download music in real time because very often the connections were so limited.
Right.
So that company that I joined was actually called Backweb. Developed this technology that would be able to notice when your connection was unused. So let's say you were surfing the web, you go to some website, and then you start reading the web page that you're visiting. Well, you're still connected, but your wire is kind of free right now. So it would actually identify that and then start downloading content in the background while you were doing that. So we would kind of download content that you would subscribe to, store it on your computer, and then you would have it be able to access it as local resources. So, a music file, a video file, images, whatever. And it was there that I finally got into web development and JavaScript. And that's also an interesting story. So around 98, I think it was, we were kind of looking for what to do with this technology. We were bouncing around between various ideas, consumer tech products for the enterprise. And we created this thing where it was like a tool for salespeople that they could access marketing material online. So, you'd like go to a website, you'd have various, let's say, brochures, marketing material. And because it was targeted at, I would say, like traveling salesmen or salespersons, back then they would definitely be offline a lot of the time. So the idea was that they should be able to say, well, these products are the ones that are especially interesting for us, and have the relevant material download and be available offline for them so that they could use it with prospective customers, even if they don't have any connectivity. And so the online part was built as a straight on website, that you would go in and see the various products. And I got this crazy idea that maybe the offline part could be done as using the same web-based user interface, so that instead of having a web-based interface to get at the online stuff and some native application to access the offline stuff, you would do everything from within the browser. And everybody thought that it was nuts. But just around that time, IE4, Internet Explorer 4 came out. And I don't know if you remember that, but that kind of like changed everything with what you could do with web technology, because it was the first browser that actually had a DOM, you might say, that you could actually program and modify. There was even the concept then of dynamic HTML as opposed to regular HTML, which was like totally static HTML. So I got this crazy idea that maybe with using this dynamic HTML and this weird language in the browser that's called JavaScript, I could maybe somehow get this local information into the browser and effectively create this rich web application that could even work offline. And I'm saying again, it's 1998. So I'm thinking about creating a rich, offline capable web application in 1998.
You invented Electron a lot of years early.
Yeah, either that or progressive web apps.
There you go.
Yeah. So the initial idea was to try to create a locally running web server, but it turns out that you can't really do something like that on Windows 98. And yeah, basically it got 0 CPU, so you would try to open the web page and nothing would happen. So we gave up on that. And instead, Microsoft had this crazy technology back then called ActiveX, which was like their answer to Netscape plugins. Wow, I'm showing my age. And the great thing about ActiveX, so you could embed these components inside the browser window, and they would take over a certain part of the browser window. So it was like, Flash Player or whatever that I guess people are kind of more familiar with. But there was another interesting option there, and that was that the ActiveX could actually talk to the JavaScript that was in the page. So I thought, hey, instead of building a display using the ActiveX, I'll make the ActiveX itself 0 size and instead push all the data that I want into the JavaScript and have the JavaScript update the DOM and display all the documents and links and whatnot directly in the DOM. So I was using the ActiveX only as a data source and actually building the user interface with JavaScript. And it worked, which was pretty insane.
I have that feeling about stuff I build sometimes. That worked? That's nuts.
Yeah, it was pretty nuts. And we would occasionally crash the browser because IE4 and all sorts of memory leaks and whatnot. And it wasn't really built to be an application platform.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could tell that it was already back then. You could tell that it was heading that way, but it wasn't there yet. By the way, at that time you didn't even have Ajax. Ajax only came around in IE 5.5 a couple of years later, in 2000, I think. So I'm talking something like a year and a half before Ajax even came around.
Wow.
Yeah. And it worked, and it was actually sold to some customers. So I had actually, people using that solution, which I found to be incredibly awesome. And we did a few more web-related stuff there. And then by the beginning of the 2000s, the bubble burst, and a lot of companies started downward spiral, including that one. And so I left, and I actually went to a company that does enterprise software development, and back there, not on the web at all. So I kind of left the web for a while, and really got back into writing code with C++ and Java, and afterwards C#, but mostly as native Windows applications or applications running on the Linux platform, but hardly anything in the web as part of my day job, you would say.
Huh.
But interestingly, I had such fond memories and experiences with the web that I kept on working with JavaScript as a hobby, which actually led to another interesting occurrence. So I'm checking the date when this happened. Something around 2002 or something like that. I'm browsing the web, because we did have the web already, and I find this article by a guy from the Netherlands called Sjoerd Visser, who basically shows how to use closures, because that's more or less when JavaScript got closures, because up to that point, it's people take things like we have JavaScript these days with E6 and all these crazy capabilities, and arrow functions and classes and destructuring and whatnot. I remember JavaScript from when it didn't even have try catch. I
know you're talking about. That's when it got closures, and I'm like, I don't remember JavaScript without closures or a DOM or a lot of these things that you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. So, by the way, going back to my first story for just 1 second, when we started writing that web interface, we actually, IE4 actually supported both JavaScript and VBScript, which was a variation of VB as scripting languages within the browsers. And we were kind of debating whether or not to use JavaScript or VBScript. And some of the people were actually pushing to use VBScript because we were using VBScript for the backend in ASP. You used to use VBScript. So they were saying kind of like the isomorphic JavaScript that we have these days. They were just like saying, we could do VBScript on both the client and the server, so why not use VBScript? And VBScript actually had one benefit over JavaScript, that it could actually handle errors. Well, JavaScript did not yet have try catch at that time. So basically, we handled errors with Windows on error if we actually wanted to intercept the error. And I kind of went with JavaScript because, based on my experiences with languages like C++ and Java on the one hand and VB on the other hand, I greatly preferred the JavaScript syntax over the VB syntax. And ultimately, we all know where the world went. But anyway, so Sjoerd wrote this interesting piece about closures and showed some of the ways in which they could be used. And it really resonated with me because back when I had written that program, one of the big challenges that we faced was that I was trying to do it object-oriented and encapsulate all my functionality in classes. But whenever I hooked up a method to an event handler on a DOM object, this value would be the DOM object rather than my object instance. And we created kind of crazy solutions like a big global map that actually mapped IDs to JavaScript object references and would leak memory like a sieve. And just to get around this whole thing of reconciling the value of this. So all of a sudden you've got closures, problem solved. You could associate the event handler with a function within a closure, and you've got the access to the object that you want to update and modify. And so I wrote back to him, and he wrote to me, and we actually ended up using this functionality to create a software library together, which was, I guess, my only really significant foray into open source. Although I'm a huge fan of open source and I greatly appreciate all the people who are working on it, I personally cannot say that I've been a big contributor, unfortunately. It seems that somewhere between my day job and the work-life balance, I can never find enough time to put into open source projects, certainly as much as I would like to. But anyway, that time I did, maybe because I had a bit more time, maybe because I was missing JavaScript while I was, at work coding on C++. So we created this library called Beyond.js. I probably put a link in the show notes or whatever, because I just, before this show, I actually searched for it and found that it's actually still online. And it's pretty nuts because we basically created this functional library, kind of like functional Lodash or maybe a Ramda style library, but back in 2002. And I remember putting this on all sorts of forums and trying to get people to look at this. And people were basically just saying, responding, well, I don't understand. This doesn't even look like JavaScript. You guys are nuts. What is this stuff good for? And it basically had, the things that you would now expect, like map and reduce and all this stuff. But nobody was doing that sort of thing back then. So it was kind of insane. JavaScript didn't actually even have bind. So we had to implement our own bind. It didn't have apply, so we had to implement our own apply to get that to work. All sorts of weird stuff. We added lazy evaluation, all sorts of crazy stuff into that. But like I said, it was a hobby, and when people didn't get it, we kind of let it drop. But if anybody feels like taking up this really old, weird functional library, I'd be happy to see that happen. It's the demos actually still work, which is a great testament to the backward compatibility of browsers and the web in general. I think that's pretty awesome. So anyway, I was playing with JavaScript, but mainly working in C++, Java, and C#. And happily for me, around 2010, 2011, I finally got a chance to go back to web development. And the company that I was working for at the time was doing remote access solutions. So essentially what this means is that you might connect to a remote computer from your computer or terminal, whatever stuff, like going from VNC to RDP to anybody who's familiar with a Citrix type solution or anything like that. I don't know how many of the people listening to the show are familiar with these types of technologies. But they're actually fairly commonly used in enterprise environments. So we had a native client for a remote access solution. And then back in 2010, I got this crazy idea that the web had progressed enough, the browsers were powerful enough that maybe you could actually do something like that in the browser. So I actually tried to convince management to let me build a remote access solution with a browser-based client. There were actually a few third-party, like open source projects out there, mostly around the VNC protocol, that did stuff like that, but they were really, really clunky, at least back then. And I thought that this was an interesting opportunity, and I got shut down because I couldn't explain to management why doing something totally within the browser is actually beneficial. So
That's changed.
Yeah.
Now
Actually,
half the time I swear I'm trying to talk people out of doing everything in the browser. It's like, no, you don't need to do that in the browser.
Yeah, it's funny. You know, people now actually run Windows in the browser. I recently opened a Windows in the browser just so that I could play Minefield or whatever it's called. Minesweeper, sorry.
Minesweeper, that's it. I almost said Minecraft, and I knew that wasn't right either.
Yeah. So anyway, but it was probably a good idea that they told me no when I initially proposed it, when I think it was either 2009 or 2010, because really the browsers weren't really ready yet for something like that. It would have come out too clunky. But then around 2010, 2011, things really started to pick up speed. I don't remember exactly when Chrome came out, but we got WebSockets, and we got Canvas, and we got HTML5 was starting to become a thing. And all of a sudden, browsers were really moving forward quickly. And you could actually do something like that in a way that actually made sense. So instead of doing something like long polling on HTTP, you could actually use WebSockets. And instead of creating a trillion DOM elements, you could actually draw a remote screen using Canvas. So all of a sudden, it did make sense, and I was actually able to pitch this to management again, and this time and do a simple demo that actually showed that this had merit, and actually got the green light to go ahead with it. And I built this product, which was a remote access solution around the RDP protocol, which is a remoting protocol that Windows has for remote access. And the crazy thing was that initially we were all sure that even with all these advancements, it's probably going to be much slower in the browser than as a native application. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that after we did a whole bunch of optimizations, the browser as the endpoint actually was faster than our native client.
Oh, wow.
Because browsers have all these, even then, certainly now, have all these integrations with the GPU. And so when you leverage the browser's capabilities to, network and then render, the browsers are really, really good at that. So once we found the best ways to kind of get out of the browser way as much as we could, we actually got awesome performance, so that you might, for example, be able to connect to some remote computer and actually play a video on that remote computer and get it reflected into the browser with audio, and I won't say 60 frames per second, but let's say 20 frames per second, which is really not bad. And that was back in 2012. So yeah, that was pretty awesome, and it turned out to be a very successful product for the company as well. We were like the first one that really had an enterprise class product. Right now, there are quite a number of such solutions out there, but back then we were like the first, and it was really awesome. And then I left that company and finally arrived at Wix.
Nice.
Around 2014, I was looking for my next challenge, and I came to Wix for an interview. And I gained, working on that remote access solution, I gained a lot of expertise around performance because, like I said, being able to hit something like 20 frames per second really required us to have highly efficient JavaScript, for example, and whatnot. So and Wix was looking for somebody to kind of be a leader for performance at Wix, or champion for performance at Wix. And that was kind of like, it worked, I hope, worked well for both sides because, well, they seem to be pleased with me because I'm still there. So, and the company is doing well. So I would like to take a little bit of credit for that as well. I joined Wix in 2014. We were around 400, 500 people back then. And now we are 2,600. So we've grown by more than fivefold within less than 5 years.
Yeah, and it's funny because my mom's a teacher, and I think she runs her classroom website on Wix. So
yeah, she and another 140 million people all over the world.
Yep. Very cool.
So now my current position at Wix is the official term. Wix is not really so much into titles, but I guess my title is Performance Tech Lead, which means I have kind of a cross-company role in helping the various teams and groups and companies within Wix to get the best performance that they can.
Right.
And since we have something like, what is it, 600, 700 front-end engineers at Wix, I certainly have my hands full in that regard. And yeah, so that's more or less where I am now.
Very cool. And we talked a bit about that work in the podcast episode on JavaScript Jabber, so I'm going to refer people to that. Mostly in the interest of time because we're basically at the end of our scheduled time. I am curious though, are there any things in particular you're looking at learning or working on these days that you're really excited about?
There's so much happening in the browsers in terms of both of technologies that are specific to performance, that are related to performance, or that have performance implications. I'm really happy about the fact that web performance has kind of become front and center for web development in general, that there's currently an understanding that if you want to be successful, then you have to be performant. At Wix, for example, something like a year ago, the CEO in front of the entire company set the 3 main strategic goals for the company as a whole. And I'm glad to say that one of them is actually performance. So that it's not just me working on performance at Wix. It's literally all of R&D working on performance at Wix. And I don't have to prod people into doing things that are related to performance. They are really happy and engaged with it. And I'm happy to say that there are a lot of technologies related to it that you can leverage these days to get the most. So anything starting from the developer tools that we have, I don't think that people give the developer tools that are built into the browsers enough credit for the success that the web has experienced. I think that, starting with Firebug and Firefox way back, and now in the Chrome developer tools, without the Chrome developer tools, I don't think we would have the modern web.
Right.
And it certainly has some amazing performance tools and capabilities built into that. So anything from the audit tab to the network tab to the performance tab. And it's such a moving target because they keep on adding new features and capabilities to that. And I think that is awesome. There's the web performance API, which keeps getting bigger and better, that we talked about in my JavaScript Jabber, the one that I participated in. And you're looking at the various frameworks, be it Angular or React or Vue, and you see all the emphasis that they are currently putting on making these frameworks again, enable the applications to be as fast and have good performance. It's really a top priority across the board. I think we kind of mentioned Svelte before the show began when we were kind of chatting away, and and I saw an amazing demo of the performance that Svelte had.
Oh, so yeah, it's got awesome performance.
Yeah, so I definitely think that there are a lot of interesting possibilities and definitely a lot of stuff to learn around performance these days. And there's so much supporting technology that you need to understand when you are talking about performance, like understanding the difference, let's say, between HTTP 1.1 and HTTP 2 and resources and progressive web apps and caching. And you keep on learning new stuff. Like just a few weeks ago, I learned that browser caching now works a lot differently than it used to, and then what I thought that, the way that I thought that it did. For example, here's a tip for our listeners. If you were, let's say, in site, let's say a.com, and download a certain resource from a URL, and then go to a different site that, let's say, b.com, and download the same resource from the same URL, you would expect that second download to come from a cache. Well, it used to, but it turns out that that's probably not necessarily the case anymore. If you're using Safari apparently uses something like a double index cache or double keyed cache, where the key is not just the URL of the resource, it's also the domain, the current domain. So even though they're both downloading the same file, it will actually not be shared across the cache, because otherwise that could lead to fingerprinting and potentially an invasion of your privacy. And so turns out that cache works a lot. That something as basic as cache is changing and is working in a way that's different from what most of us might think that's the way that it works.
Yep. Very cool. Well, I'm going to push us over to picks. Are there some things that you want to shout out about on the show?
Yeah. So, like I said, I will definitely put the link to that library I mentioned, and an article that provides like a brief explanation of it. And like I said, if anybody wants to play with aging functional technology, I'd be really pleased with that. There's also another blog post that I wrote about, that first rich web application that I created with a bit more technical detail. I'll provide the link to that as well. And other than that, like I said, I participated recently in a web conference here in Israel. You Gotta Love Frontend, or YGLF conference. Hopefully, by the time this podcast comes out, the videos for that will be up, and there were some great sessions there. So I highly recommend checking that out, and we can probably put a link to that as well. And that more or less covers it for me.
Cool. I'm going to throw in a couple of picks. So today I went for a run, and I just went over to the gym.
Wow, you're a runner.
Yeah, I've been training for a marathon. So
wow,
I love it. I love the running. I love the training. I hired a coach back in December to help me prep for the marathon, and she put in my exercises in this app that we use. It's called V.02. So if you want to track workouts, or you can actually invite a coach to join you, so that they can see your stuff.
So who's more fit, you or Amy Knight?
Amy. No doubt. Amy is more fit than I am. That woman's a machine, let me tell you.
Yeah, she's amazing. She's awesome.
Yep. But I'm really digging it. And I started posting some of my workouts to Instagram, and I've really been enjoying that too. So I'm going to pick Instagram.
I don't actually run. I'm not such a big fan of running, but I do go to the gym, and you do need to keep yourself fit. And I got another great thing, which is that I can ride my bike to work. So I actually ride my bike to the park to my office every day. So it's like a half hour each way through the park. Nice. This is really awesome.
Yeah, I work from home, so yeah, my commute, I guess I could ride my bike around the block or something. Yeah. Very nice. Well, if people want to find you online, where do they go?
Well, I'm fairly active on Twitter. I'm really close to the 2,000 followers mark. So maybe your listeners, if I haven't passed it by the time this podcast comes out, maybe a few of your listeners can help me achieve this goal. I probably, you don't really get anything in return, but it'll still be nice.
Amazing tweets, folks. Being modest.
Thank you.
All that wisdom.
All that wisdom. I do like to do some JavaScript riddles every once in a while. So if anybody, that might be another interesting link. Put a link to both a conference talk that I once gave with a list of JavaScript riddles, and also a link to Twitter where based on a hashtag that you can find all my JavaScript riddles. So that could provide hours of fun to your listeners. So that might be a cool link as well to put there. And I've also started posting stuff on Quora, and I've got a surprising number of readers there.
I like Quora.
You do? Yeah, I like reading stuff there. A lot of interesting anecdotal stuff.
Yep.
And there's also the Wix Engineering blog, where I post every once in a blue moon.
Very cool. All right. Well, thank you for coming, Dan. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up because I've got to jump on another call, but thanks for coming. And we will catch you.
I enjoyed it very much. I greatly appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thanks again.
Thank you.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.